Elena, I'm sorry. You have to leave.
Leave? Damien, I'm carrying your child. Then why is there so much about this pregnancy that we don't know? Because the truth is bigger than all of you realize.
Rain does not fall gently on the night Simone Carter loses everything. It comes down in sheets, hard and cold, hammering the gravel driveway of a house that was never supposed to belong to her in the first place. A baby is crying somewhere close, thin and frightened. The kind of cry that comes from a small body that has no words yet for what has just happened to it. A suitcase sits on the wet stones, the fabric already soaking through. One will snap from being dragged too fast down a driveway that seemed endless in the dark. And a woman's voice, cold and clipped and final, cuts through the storm like it was made for exactly this moment. You were never one of us. That is where this story begins. Not with a wedding. Not with a birth, not even with a death, though all three of those things happened, and happened in that order, and happened to change everything. This story begins with a woman standing in the rain with a screaming infant on her hip and a single overnight bag holding everything she owns, watching a gate close behind her that she once believed she'd walk through for the rest of her life. Before we go any further, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 7 years later, Simone Carter is standing in front of that same gate again. She is 31 years old now, though there are moments, standing here, when she feels much older than that, and other moments when she feels exactly as young and as powerless as she did the night she left. The rain has just started, the first fat drops striking the shoulders of her coat, darkening the pavement beneath her boots one splash at a time. She hasn't touched this gate in 7 years. She has driven past the end of this road exactly once, on a day she told herself was an accident of geography, a wrong turn on the way to somewhere else, though she has never quite believed her own explanation for that. The iron bars in front of her are the same ones. The same scrollwork curls at the top, the same green patina eating slowly into the black paint near the hinges. Millbrook has not changed. Millbrook, she has come to understand, does not change for anyone. It simply waits, the way old money always waits, patient and untroubled by the passage of ordinary time, certain that eventually the world will come back around to it. In her hand is an envelope. The paper is heavy, expensive, the kind that costs more per sheet than she used to spend on groceries in the first hard months after she left this place. The return address is printed in a deep, confident navy ink. Whitaker Construction and Land Holdings. She has not opened it. She has been carrying it, unopened, for 3 days, in her bag, on the seat of her car, on the kitchen table where she stared at it over coffee that went cold twice, in the pocket of this same coat she is wearing now, because some part of her has been afraid that whatever is written inside those few folded pages will be the kind of sentence you cannot take back once you have read it. She turns it over once in her fingers, feeling the weight of the paper stock, the small raised texture of the letterhead beneath her thumb, and for a moment the sound of the rain seems to fall away entirely, replaced by something older and closer, a sound that lives only in memory now but has never once, in 7 years, gone completely quiet. She remembers the porch light that night. A single yellow bulb, humming faintly, moths circling it in lazy, drunken loops even in the rain, because moths, she thinks now, never seem to understand when a light is not worth flying toward. She remembers the way Denise Whitaker stood just outside its reach, her face half in shadow, her voice perfectly level, as though she were reading a grocery list rather than ending a life. She remembers the exact words. Not close to them. The exact words, because some sentences carve themselves into a person so deeply that the mind never rounds off their edges, never softens them the way it softens almost everything else with enough time. You were never one of us. For words. Simone has turned those 4 words over more times than she could ever count. In the dark, in the shower, in the quiet moment just before sleep, when the mind goes looking for old wounds the way a tongue goes looking for a loose tooth. And every time, she has arrived at the same conclusion. Denise Whitaker did not say those words in anger. She said them the way a judge reads a verdict. Calm, certain, already decided long before the courtroom door ever opened. Grace had been 4 months old. 4 months old, and already she had learned to cry the specific cry of a child who senses her mother's fear before she has any language to name what fear is. Simone remembers holding her against her chest that night, one arm wrapped tight beneath her, the other hand gripping the handle of a suitcase that held almost nothing useful, because she had packed it in under 6 minutes with hands that would not stop shaking. She remembers the gravel biting through the thin soles of the shoes she happened to be wearing that day. Ordinary shoes, meant for an ordinary Tuesday, not for the last walk she would ever take down this driveway, as anything resembling a member of this family. She remembers looking back once, just once, at the house behind her, its windows glowing gold and warm against the storm. Every one of those rooms full of furniture and memory and a life she had believed, right up until that exact hour, was hers to keep. It was not a life she had asked for. That is the part people rarely understand when they hear the outline of this story secondhand, the part that gets lost somewhere between the words married into money and kicked out with a baby, as though those two facts alone tell you everything you need to know about a woman like Simone Carter. She had not gone looking for the Whitaker name. She had been a dietary aide at a hospital in Savannah, 23 years old, saving in small, stubborn increments toward night classes she rarely had the energy left to attend after a 12-hour shift on her feet. She met Marcus Whitaker in a hallway outside the cardiac ward, where he had come to sit with his grandfather 3 evenings a week, alone, without an entourage, without anyone from his family's construction empire trailing behind him to remind the world who he was. He did not introduce himself with his last name. It took her 3 weeks to learn it, and when she did, she nearly walked away from him entirely, because she had grown up hearing exactly what kind of family absorbs a girl like her, and exactly what kind of ending that story tends to have. She should have listened to that instinct. She thinks that now, standing at this gate, rain gathering at the collar of her coat, sliding cold down the back of her neck, she should have trusted the small, quiet voice that told her some doors, once you walk through them, are built only to swing one direction. And yet there was Marcus, who remembered she took her coffee black before she had ever told him, who learned her mother's name before Simone had thought to offer it, who proposed to her not in some manicured ballroom with string lights and a hired photographer, but at her cousin Naomi's kitchen table, over a pot of coffee gone lukewarm, because he understood, without ever being told, that Simone would have hated anything grander than that. There was a version of this story she has thought more times than she can count, where none of the rest of it ever happened, where Marcus lived, where the gate never closed behind her, where Grace grew up knowing her father's laugh instead of only his photographs. That version does not exist. It never did. And Simone has spent 7 years learning, slowly, painfully, one exhausted night at a time, how to stop reaching for a version of her life that was taken from her before she ever got the chance to hold it properly. The rain is falling harder now, the kind of steady, determined rain that Savannah gets in early autumn, warm even as it soaks through fabric, thick with the smell of wet oak leaves and distant thunder still too far off to hear. Simone has not moved from the spot just outside the gate. Her thumb runs once more over the raised letters of the envelope in her hand. Whitaker Construction. Not a personal letterhead. Not Denise's private stationery. The pale cream cardstock she used to send handwritten notes that always managed to sound like corrections rather than kindness. This is company paper. Official. Formal. The kind of letter you send when you need something to be undeniable, something a person cannot later claim they misunderstood. She thinks about the last time she stood exactly where she is standing now, 7 years ago, a suitcase at her feet instead of an envelope in her hand, a screaming infant instead of the strange, aching quiet she feels tonight. She thinks about every hard year in between. The apartment with Naomi that smelled permanently of instant coffee and baby powder. The two jobs stacked on top of each other like unstable furniture, always threatening to collapse. The car that got repossessed on a Tuesday morning while Grace watched from the window in her pajamas, too young to understand why her mother was crying over a car. The birthday cake made from a box mix because there was nothing else in the cabinet, and Simone had refused, on principle, to let her daughter's birthday pass with nothing at all. She thinks about all of it, standing here, and she understands something with sudden, bone-deep clarity. Whatever is inside this envelope is not simply a letter. It is a door. And doors, she has learned the hard way, are rarely as simple as they look from the outside. Her hand moves toward the latch. The iron is cold and slick with rain beneath her fingers, colder than she expected, the kind of cold that seems to travel straight up through the skin and settle somewhere behind the ribs. Somewhere beyond the gate, past the long gravel drive, she can still see in perfect detail with her eyes closed. The house is waiting. Millbrook does not change. It never has. It simply waits, patient as old money always is, certain, in the particular arrogant way that wealth is always certain, that the people it has cast aside will eventually find a reason to come back. The question is not whether Simone Carter still remembers what happened on this driveway 7 years ago. She remembers every second of it, every syllable, every drop of rain. The real question, the one that has kept her awake 3 nights running with an unopened envelope on her nightstand, is a far harder one to answer. What, after everything that family took from her, could possibly be inside that letter powerful enough to make her open this gate again? 8 years earlier, before any of it, before the rain and the suitcase and the 4 words that would follow her the rest of her life, Simone Carter was simply a young woman trying to build something steady out of very little. She worked the evening shift in the dietary department of a hospital just outside downtown Savannah, pushing carts of trays down long fluorescent-lit hallways, learning the names of patients before she ever learned the names of doctors, because it was the patients who remembered her kindness and the doctors who rarely looked up long enough to notice her at all. She was 23, sharing a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with her cousin Naomi Bishop, splitting rent down to the dollar, setting aside whatever was left at the end of each month into an envelope taped behind a dresser drawer. Money meant for night classes in nutrition science that she attended twice a week when her body wasn't too tired to sit upright through a lecture. She was not a woman waiting to be rescued. She had never once thought of her life in those terms. She was simply a woman doing the math on a future she intended to build with her own 2 hands, one modest paycheck at a time. She met Marcus Whitaker on a Tuesday evening in a hallway outside the cardiac care unit, where an elderly man named Samuel Whitaker had been recovering from a procedure that had frightened his entire family more than anyone wanted to admit out loud. Marcus came 3 evenings a week, alone, no assistant trailing him, no company car idling in the visitor's lot with a driver waiting. He wore his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow and carried himself like a man who had spent time doing physical work rather than only signing off on it, which, Simone would later learn, was true. He had spent 2 summers during college on his family's job sites, laying foundation forms in the Georgia heat, because his grandfather Samuel had insisted that no Whitaker would run a construction company without first understanding, in his own hands, what construction actually cost a body. Their first real conversation happened by accident, the kind of accident that only happens in hallways at 10 at night when both people are too tired to keep up their guard. Simone was pushing a cart of dinner trays back toward the kitchen, and Marcus, sitting outside his grandfather's room with 2 paper cups of vending machine coffee, offered her one without asking any of the usual questions people ask when they're trying to figure out where you fit in the world. He didn't ask what she did for a living beyond the obvious uniform. He didn't ask where she was from in that particular tone people use when they're really asking whether you belong somewhere. He asked if she'd been on shift since morning, and when she said yes, He simply said that must be exhausting, and then he was quiet, letting her drink her coffee in peace, which she would later tell Naomi was the single most attractive thing a man had ever done for her. It took him 3 weeks to mention his last name, and only because Samuel, from his hospital bed, loudly informed a passing nurse that his grandson ran half the construction projects in 3 counties, a comment Marcus visibly wished he could take back the moment it left his grandfather's mouth. Simone remembers the walk to her car that night, replaying the words Whitaker Construction in her head, feeling something in her chest go cold and cautious, because she had grown up hearing exactly what kind of family absorbs a woman like her, uses her for a season, and quietly sets her back down exactly where they found her. She nearly stopped answering his calls that week. She told Naomi as much, sitting at their kitchen table, turning a chipped coffee mug in slow circles. Naomi, never one to soften an opinion for the sake of comfort, told her plainly that she was allowed to be careful, but she wasn't allowed to punish a good man for the sins of people he hadn't even introduced her to yet. She kept answering the calls, and slowly, carefully, in the unhurried way real trust is built rather than declared, Marcus proved himself to be exactly as ordinary and exactly as decent as he had seemed in that hallway with 2 cups of bad coffee. He remembered, without being told twice, that she took her coffee black. He learned her mother's name, and the name of the street she'd grown up on, before Simone had ever thought to volunteer either. He drove 2 hours each way, more than once, just to sit with her at a diner near her mother's house, because he understood, without being told, that some relationships require you to show up in the places that matter to the other person rather than only the places that are convenient for you. The first time he brought her to Millbrook, she knew within the first 10 minutes of that dinner exactly how she would be measured at that table for the rest of her life. Denise Whitaker asked, in the same breath as passing the bread, where Simone's people were from, a question that carried a weight far beyond its simple wording, the kind of question designed to sort a person quickly and quietly into a category before the meal was even finished. Harold Whitaker, seated at the head of the table, was kinder in his manner but no less absent in his authority, deferring on nearly every subject to his wife's judgment with the practiced ease of a man who had learned decades earlier which battles were worth the cost of fighting. Simone answered every question that night with a steady voice and a straight spine, because her mother had raised her to never let a room like that see her flinch, whatever it cost her to hold that posture. Marcus proposed to her 7 months later, not in some grand ballroom with hired string lights and a photographer paid to capture the moment from 3 flattering angles, but at Naomi's kitchen table, on an ordinary Thursday evening, over a pot of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. He told her he didn't want to ask her somewhere fancy, because he knew she would spend the whole time worrying about whether she was using the right fork instead of actually hearing the question. He asked her to marry him the way he had done everything else since that hallway 3 weeks into knowing her, plainly, without performance, in a way built for exactly who she was rather than who a family like his might have wished she was instead. There was a prenuptial agreement drafted before the wedding, of course, because there is always a prenuptial agreement drafted before a wedding in a family like the Whitakers. Isabel Reyes, the family's longtime attorney, arrived at Millbrook one afternoon with a folder thick enough to require its own leather case, prepared, as she always was, to protect the family's holdings from every conceivable direction. Marcus refused to put the document in front of Simone. Simone remembers the exact tone of his voice when he said it, calm but immovable, telling his mother directly, in front of Isabel, that if Simone had wanted his money, she would have asked for it long before now, and he would not insult the woman he loved by asking her to prove otherwise on paper. Denise's face in that moment was a portrait Simone has never fully forgotten. A flicker of something colder than disappointment passing behind her eyes before she composed herself back into practiced neutrality. It was a small moment, easy to miss if you weren't watching closely. Simone was watching closely. She has thought about that flicker more times over the years than she ever expected to. The wedding itself was small, deliberately so, held at a modest chapel Simone's mother had attended her whole life rather than the cathedral Denise had quietly suggested twice. There were no magazine photographers, no seating chart drawn up according to donor tiers, nothing about the day that Denise Whitaker would have chosen if the choice had been left entirely to her. Simone remembers Denise's expression throughout the ceremony, polite and composed on the surface, visibly uncomfortable underneath, a woman attending an event she had not designed and could not fully control, which, Simone has come to understand since, may be the single thing Denise Whitaker has always feared most in this world. Grace was born 11 months later, in the middle of a warm Savannah spring, and for one short season, everything Simone had feared about that family seemed to fall quietly away. She remembers Denise holding her granddaughter for the first time, the older woman's usually rigid shoulders softening in a way Simone had never witnessed before or would witness again, her voice dropping into something almost tender as she counted Grace's fingers out loud. Harold cried openly at the hospital, no performance in it at all. Simply an old man overwhelmed by the sight of new life carrying his family's name forward. For a handful of weeks, Simone allowed herself to believe that whatever cold arithmetic had once measured her worth at that dinner table had finally been settled in her favor, once and for all, by the simple fact of her daughter's existence. She did not yet know how quickly that arithmetic could be reversed. She did not yet know that the same family capable of counting a newborn's fingers with tears in their eyes was equally capable, under the right pressure, of standing in the rain and telling that same child's mother that she had never truly belonged among them at all. That reversal was still months away. But looking back now, standing at this gate with an unopened envelope in her hand, Simone can see, more clearly than she ever could in the moment it was happening, the small warning signs she chose not to read too closely at the time. Denise's flicker of cold disappointment over an unsigned prenuptial agreement. Harold's habit of yielding every real decision to his wife the instant it mattered. Isabel Reyes's careful, watchful silence at every family gathering. A woman who always seemed to know slightly more than she was saying. None of it was enough, back then, to make Simone doubt the life she was building. She loved Marcus Whitaker without complication or hesitation, and for a while, that love felt like more than enough armor against anything his family might one day decide to throw at her. She did not yet know how wrong she was. She did not yet know how little time she had left before the accident that would take Marcus from her entirely, and take, along with him, every fragile piece of goodwill his family had ever extended toward her. That part of the story was still coming. It always is, in stories like this one. The warmth always arrives first, so the cold that follows it can cut all the deeper. The accident happened on a Thursday morning in early October, the kind of ordinary Thursday that gives no warning of the life it is about to end. Marcus had left the house before dawn, the way he often did that season, driving out to a job site on the western edge of the county where Whitaker Construction was clearing ground for a new distribution center, a contract Harold had been chasing for the better part of a year. Simone remembers the last thing he said to her that morning, standing in the kitchen with Grace asleep against her shoulder, not because it was profound, but because it was ordinary, the kind of small parting sentence a person says 1,000 times without ever imagining it might be the last one. He told her he'd be back in time for dinner, and he kissed the top of Grace's head, and he was gone. The call came a little after 11. Simone remembers almost nothing about the conversation itself except the sound of her own voice asking the same question 3 times, as though repetition might change the answer she was being given. A company truck Marcus had been driving that morning, one of the older vehicles still in the fleet, had gone off the shoulder of a service road on the job site and rolled twice before coming to rest against a stand of pines. The official explanation, delivered first by a site foreman and later repeated almost word for word by the county's accident report, cited a mechanical failure in the steering column, the kind of failure that investigators are supposed to catch during routine inspection, the kind of failure that should never have been allowed anywhere near a public road, let alone a job site with a man's life riding on it. Simone did not understand the full weight of that detail on the day it was given to her. She was too shattered by grief to hold on to anything except the single, unbearable fact that Marcus was gone. What she did not know, what she would not learn for years, was that this was not the first time concerns had been raised about that particular truck. It had failed 2 prior safety citations over the preceding year, citations that had been quietly resolved on paper without the vehicle ever being pulled fully from rotation. She did not know this on the day of the funeral. She barely knew her own name on the day of the funeral. The service was held at a church Denise selected, not the small chapel where Simone and Marcus had married, and Simone was seated, by careful arrangement she only noticed after the fact, near the back of the sanctuary rather than beside Harold and Denise at the front, as though her grief belonged to a lesser category than theirs. She held Grace through most of the service, the baby quiet for once, as if even a 4-month-old could sense that stillness was the only thing the room could hold. Harold wept openly, the same way he had wept at Grace's birth, grief without performance, a grandfather and a father in one collapsing frame. Denise did not weep, not once, not visibly, sitting through the entire service with her spine perfectly straight and her hands folded, a composure that Simone, even in the depth of her own devastation, found herself quietly afraid of. The change in Denise did not happen all at once. It happened the way most cruelty in families like the Whitakers happens, in small, deniable increments, each one easy to dismiss on its own, each one only becoming visible as a pattern once enough of them had accumulated. It began with silence. Denise stopped returning Simone's calls within days of the funeral, calls that had, in the beginning, only been about small, practical things, questions about which of Marcus's belongings Simone should keep, questions about funeral costs that Simone, in her grief, hadn't thought to ask about directly. Then came the meetings Simone was no longer invited to, conversations about the estate and the company that used to include her as a matter of course and now, quietly, did not. With the pieces finally connected, Raymond understood that he and Marcus were no longer dealing with a simple misunderstanding between a husband and wife. They were dealing with a carefully constructed deception, one built by a woman who had spent years learning exactly which fears to exploit and exactly how to make herself appear blameless while doing it. Marcus explained that after his own relationship with Vivian ended years earlier, he had quietly kept tabs on her, unable to shake the feeling that her charm concealed something far more calculating than anyone in his family wanted to admit. What began as personal caution had slowly evolved into a genuine investigation, one that now, combined with Raymond's findings, painted a picture clear enough to bring before a judge if necessary, though both men agreed the truth deserved to be heard by the family first. Elena, still recovering physically and emotionally in the quiet motel room, was brought fully into the investigation as Raymond laid out everything he and Marcus had uncovered. For the first time since the night at the gate, she felt something shift inside her that was not grief or fear, but clarity. She had spent months questioning her own judgment, wondering if she had somehow caused the collapse of her marriage through carelessness or naivety. Now she understood the truth had never depended on her at all. It had been engineered, piece by piece, by someone who saw her happiness as an obstacle standing between Vivian and the life she believed she deserved. With that understanding came a quiet strength Elena had not felt in months, a resolve to see this through not out of anger alone, but out of a need to protect her child from ever growing up beneath the weight of a lie. Not long after, Elena went into labor earlier than expected, the timing catching everyone off guard except perhaps her own body, which seemed to sense that this new chapter needed to begin on its own terms. Raymond drove her to the hospital himself, staying close throughout the long hours that followed, while Dr. Whitfield oversaw the delivery with the same steady calm she had shown throughout the entire pregnancy. There were no grand estates or waiting rooms filled with family in this moment. Only the quiet intensity of labor and the presence of two people who had shown Elena more genuine loyalty than anyone inside the Cole mansion ever had. When her daughter was finally born, Elena held her for a long, silent moment before choosing a name, one that honored her father and the quiet strength he had instilled in her long before any of this began. Word reached the estate quickly, and it was not Damien who arrived at the hospital first, but Margaret. She stood in the doorway of Elena's hospital room for a long moment before stepping inside, her usual composure noticeably absent, replaced instead by something closer to vulnerability than Elena had ever witnessed in her. Margaret admitted, in a voice far softer than the one Elena had grown accustomed to, that fear had shaped every decision she made since learning of the pregnancy, fear rooted in a loss she had never fully allowed herself to grieve. She spoke of Damien's older sister for the first time in Elena's presence, her voice catching as she described losing a child to circumstances she had never been able to fully control or understand. She had convinced herself that distance and silence would protect this new baby from a similar fate, not realizing her silence had instead nearly destroyed the very family she was trying to save. Margaret asked, hesitantly, if she could hold her granddaughter, and Elena, watching the older woman's hands tremble as she reached out, found herself unable to refuse. In that quiet hospital room, something began to shift between them, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of understanding neither woman had believed possible only weeks earlier. Margaret held the baby close, tears finally breaking through the composed exterior she had maintained for so long, and whispered an apology Elena had needed to hear months before this moment, one that could not undo what had happened, but could finally begin to explain it. The confrontation with Vivian came days later, arranged carefully by Raymond and Marcus in a private meeting at the family's corporate offices, evidence laid out plainly on the table before her. Vivian's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the entire ordeal, finally cracked under the weight of financial records, technician testimony, and a timeline that left no room for denial. She attempted to deflect, then to justify, before finally falling silent as the full scope of her manipulation became undeniable to everyone in the room, including staff members who had once treated her as a welcomed insider. Legal consequences followed swiftly, charges of fraud and evidence tampering that would ensure Vivian's carefully constructed influence over the family finally came to an end. Damien's reckoning arrived more slowly, without the courtroom drama that surrounded Vivian's downfall. He came to Elena not with grand gestures or rehearsed apologies, but with a quiet, difficult honesty about his own weakness, admitting that his fear of disappointing his mother had made him complicit in destroying the one relationship in his life that had never been built on obligation or expectation. Elena listened, but she did not offer immediate forgiveness, understanding that trust broken so completely could not be repaired with words alone. She told him plainly that if he wanted any place in his daughter's life, it would have to be earned through consistency, not promises, a condition he accepted without argument, recognizing for the first time exactly how much he had nearly lost. A year later, Elena had built a life defined by purpose rather than survival, running a small foundation dedicated to supporting mothers facing crisis, funded in part by a portion of the Cole family's holdings, offered not as charity, but as rightful restitution for everything she had endured. Margaret had become a steady, genuine presence in her granddaughter's life, her once rigid formality softened by the love she had nearly lost the chance to express. Damien remained present as well, showing up consistently in small, unremarkable ways that slowly began rebuilding the trust he had broken, understanding that actions, not declarations, would determine whether he ever truly earned his way back into the life of the woman he had once let walk into the rain alone. On the day Elena chose to return to the estate, she walked through those same gates once again, her daughter resting on her hip, sunlight breaking through clouds that had finally cleared. And this time, the gate opened not because she needed permission to enter, but because she had chosen, on her own terms, to let them back into her life. If this story moved you the way it moved so many others watching tonight, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. And if you have not already subscribed, take a moment to do so now, because there are so many more stories like Elena's still waiting to be told. In the months following her return to the estate, Elena discovered that healing did not arrive all at once, but in small, uneven moments that accumulated slowly over time. There were mornings when she walked through the halls that once felt hostile and unfamiliar, and found herself pausing, waiting for the same cold silence she had grown accustomed to during the darkest stretch of her pregnancy. It never came. Staff members who had once avoided her gaze now greeted her warmly, some quietly apologizing for their own silence during those difficult months, admitting they had been afraid of losing their positions if they showed her any kindness, while the family's narrative painted her as an outsider. Elena forgave them easily, understanding that fear moves people in ways courage rarely does, and that surviving within a household built on hierarchy required a different kind of self-preservation than the one she had needed. Margaret's transformation continued in ways that surprised even those who had known her longest. She began spending entire afternoons in the nursery, something the household staff quietly admitted she had never done even during her own children's infancies. She read to her granddaughter in the same clipped, formal voice she used for everything else, yet there was a softness beneath it now, an openness that had not existed before the hospital room confession. She spoke more freely about Damien's late sister, no longer treating her memory as something to be buried beneath decades of practiced composure. Elena listened during these conversations, understanding that Margaret was not simply bonding with a grandchild, but slowly allowing herself to grieve a loss she had carried silently for far too long, and in doing so, finally releasing some of the fear that had once driven her to nearly destroy the very family she was trying to protect. Vivian's legal proceedings unfolded over the following months, drawing quiet but persistent attention from those within the family's social circle who had once considered her a welcome presence. The fraud charges connected to the falsified paternity case years earlier, combined with clear evidence of evidence tampering in Elena's situation, left little room for the kind of leniency Vivian had likely expected given her previous closeness to the family. Marcus attended every hearing, a steady, quiet presence who had waited over a year for this exact reckoning, understanding that his own painful history with Vivian had ultimately given him the patience and determination needed to see the investigation through to its conclusion. When the final judgment was delivered, Vivian's carefully built reputation collapsed entirely, and the family she had spent years trying to manipulate her way back into finally closed its doors to her for good. Damien's path toward earning back Elena's trust was neither quick nor comfortable, exactly as she had told him it needed to be. He attended every appointment, every milestone, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon that most people overlook entirely, understanding that consistency, not grand romantic gestures, was the only currency that mattered now. There were moments Elena still watched him with guarded distance, unable to fully release the memory of the man who had once stood coldly in the rain and told her to leave. Yet slowly, through months of showing up without excuses and without expectation of immediate forgiveness, something between them began to shift, not back into what it once was, but into something new, built more honestly than their relationship had ever been built before. Raymond remained a constant presence in Elena's life throughout this entire process, the same steady, unwavering support he had promised her father decades earlier. He often visited on weekends, sitting on the porch of the small guest house Elena kept for herself on the estate grounds, a space she insisted on maintaining even after fully returning to the family, a quiet reminder that she never again intended to feel entirely dependent on anyone else's permission to exist. Raymond watched her daughter grow with the same quiet pride he might have shown his own grandchild, and Elena often told him, only half joking, that he had done more to save her life than anyone else involved in the entire ordeal, a statement he always brushed off modestly, insisting he had simply kept a promise made long ago. Dr. Whitfield's careful documentation, once dismissed as an offhand comment during a routine appointment, became something of a quiet legend within the family's private conversations, a reminder that the truth often exists long before anyone realizes its significance. Elena visited her occasionally even after the pregnancy concluded, not out of medical necessity, but out of genuine gratitude for a woman who had unknowingly safeguarded her future during a period when almost no one else had. As the foundation Elena built continued to grow, expanding its reach to support mothers across the region facing situations far too similar to her own, she often found herself reflecting on the woman she had been standing outside that gate in the rain, 7 months pregnant and utterly alone. She recognized now that the woman who survived that night had never truly disappeared, only grown quieter for a while, waiting patiently for the moment she would need to step forward again. Elena never forgot the sound of that gate closing behind her, the mechanical hiss that had once felt like the ending of everything she believed her life would become. She understood now that it had never been an ending at all, only the beginning of a story far stronger than the one she had originally been living. A story defined not by what the Cole family had taken from her, but by everything she had ultimately built for herself despite it. If Elena's journey has stayed with you tonight the way it has stayed with so many others, take a moment to share where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you have not yet subscribed, join our community now so you never miss the next story waiting to be told. Years later, when Elena's daughter was old enough to ask questions about the mansion she sometimes visited and the grandmother who doted on her so completely, Elena chose honesty over the comfortable silence she could have easily hidden behind. She told her, gently and in pieces suited to her age, that their family had once nearly broken apart entirely, that love alone had not been enough to protect them, and that it had taken courage, patience, and people willing to tell the truth to put things back together. She wanted her daughter to understand that strength did not always look like fighting loudly. Sometimes it looked like Dr. Whitfield keeping careful records nobody thought to question. Sometimes it looked like Raymond answering a phone call at midnight without hesitation. Sometimes it simply looked like a woman standing outside a gate in the rain, refusing to let that moment become the end of her story instead of merely a painful chapter within it. Margaret lived long enough to watch her granddaughter grow into a thoughtful young girl who resembled Elena far more than she resembled anyone else in the Cole family, a fact Margaret mentioned often, always with a warmth that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those first cold months of Elena's pregnancy. Before she passed, Margaret made certain her will reflected not obligation, but genuine intention, ensuring the foundation Elena built would continue expanding for generations, a final acknowledgement of the truth she had spent so long trying to outrun. Damien, older and steadier by then, often told his daughter that her mother had taught him more about honesty in one difficult year than his entire upbringing had taught him about anything else, a quiet admission he never seemed embarrassed to repeat. Elena never forgot the gate, the rain, or the sound it made closing behind her that night, but she stopped allowing that memory to define her long before her daughter ever asked about it directly. She had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the people who truly love you do not require silence in exchange for belonging, and that sometimes the family you build through loyalty and truth matters far more than the family you were simply given by circumstance. Her story, once nearly buried beneath lies designed to erase her entirely, became instead a testament to exactly how much a woman carrying far more than a child inside her can survive, rebuild, and ultimately reclaim. If Elena's journey touched you tonight, share where you're watching from in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more stories like hers still waiting to be told.